Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. It used to swing outward like every normal door. I even remember the hinge on the left side, but something changed. Now it opens inward toward where I sleep, and I never touched the hinges. I didn't flip it. I didn't repair anything. One night it just opened wrong. I thought I was dreaming, but the marks on the carpet proved otherwise. I closed it. It opened again the next day, just a little, like an invitation. Last night, I pushed a chair against it. This morning, the chair was inside. And now, when I look at it, I swear I see breathing in the dark. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not unpleasant, just wrong. Like vanilla mixed with something metallic, something that shouldn't exist in my bedroom. It clung to the air near the closet door, faint but persistent, like a memory trying to surface. I walked closer, my bare feet silent on the carpet, and pressed my palm against the white wood. The surface felt warm. Not room temperature warm, but body warm, as if something had been leaning against it from the other side. I pulled my hand away and stared at the door. The brass handle gleamed in the afternoon light filtering through my window. Everything looked normal, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sensation crawled up my spine, settling at the base of my neck like cold fingers. I reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The door opened inward with a soft creak, revealing the familiar darkness of my closet. Clothes hung undisturbed. Shoes lined the bottom. Boxes stacked neatly on the shelf above. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. I closed the door and walked away, but the vanilla scent followed me. It wasn't coming from the closet anymore. It was coming from me, clinging to my skin where I had touched the door. I washed my hands twice, scrubbing until the water ran scalding hot, but the smell remained. That night, I lay in bed staring at the closet door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but I couldn't sleep. The darkness felt thicker around that door, as if it were absorbing light rather than simply blocking it. The next morning, I found the door slightly ajar. Just a crack, barely visible unless you looked directly at it. I was certain I had closed it the night before. I pushed it shut and made a mental note to check the latch. Maybe it was loose. Maybe the house was settling. Reasonable explanations. But when I pressed my ear against the wood, I heard something that made my blood chill. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that didn't match my own rhythm. I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound stopped. I pressed my ear to the door again. Silence. But the warm feeling had returned, stronger now, as if the wood itself were alive. I opened the door quickly, flooding the space with light. Empty. Normal. Nothing but my clothes and the faint scent of vanilla that now seemed to pulse with each of my heartbeats. I decided to document everything. If something was happening, I needed proof. I started a journal, writing down every detail, every anomaly. The way the handle felt slightly sticky sometimes, as if invisible fingers had been gripping it. The way the hinges seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at them. The way my reflection in the mirror looked wrong when the closet door was open, as if I were standing in a different room entirely. The door began opening more frequently. Never fully, always just enough to create a thin line of darkness that seemed to watch me. I tried blocking it with books, with weights, with anything heavy enough to keep it closed. But every morning, I would find the objects moved aside, arranged neatly on the floor as if someone had carefully placed them there. The breathing sounds grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes I heard whispers, too soft to understand, but loud enough to make my skin crawl. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room, but it didn't help. The vanilla scent had spread throughout the house, following me wherever I went. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that didn't correspond to any object in the room. The mirrors throughout the house began showing inconsistencies. My reflection would lag behind my movements by just a fraction of a second, or I would see myself from angles that should have been impossible. One night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I sat in front of the closet door with my journal and a flashlight, determined to witness the phenomenon firsthand. The door was closed, but I could feel it wanting to open. The air grew thick, almost solid, pressing against my chest. The vanilla scent intensified until it became overwhelming, making my eyes water and my throat close. Then the door began to open. Not quickly, not violently, but with deliberate slowness. The darkness beyond seemed to move, shifting and writhing like liquid shadow. I shined my flashlight into the space, but the beam seemed to bend and twist, illuminating nothing. The breathing sounds grew louder, more urgent, and I realized they were coming from behind me now, not from inside the closet. I turned around, and my blood turned to ice. There, pressed against the bedroom window, was a face. My face, but wrong. The features were too sharp, the eyes too wide, the smile too knowing. It was looking at me with an expression I had never worn, could never wear. The thing that looked like me pressed its palm against the glass, and I watched as the window began to fog from the inside. I ran to the window, but there was nothing there. No handprint, no fog, no face. Just the empty darkness of the yard beyond. But when I turned back to the closet, the door was fully open, and the darkness inside had changed. It no longer looked like empty space. It looked like depth, like a tunnel leading somewhere I couldn't see. The breathing sounds had multiplied, creating a symphony of inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from every direction at once. I grabbed the door handle to close it, but my hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. The handle, the door, the entire closet, everything had become insubstantial. I could see my clothes hanging in the darkness, but they looked different now, older, as if they had been there for years. The vanilla scent was so strong I could taste it, sweet and metallic on my tongue. I backed away from the closet, my journal clutched to my chest, and that's when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror across the room showed me standing in front of the closet. But the closet in the reflection was different. It was larger, deeper, and filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. The me in the mirror was smiling, but I wasn't smiling. The me in the mirror was reaching towards something I couldn't see. I covered the mirror with a sheet, but I could still feel it watching me. The breathing sounds had become constant now, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I tried to leave the room, but the door handle wouldn't turn. I was trapped with the closet, with the breathing, with the smell of vanilla that had become so intense it made my head spin. The closet door is still open. It's been open for days now, and I can't close it. The darkness inside has begun to spill out, creeping across the floor like fog. My reflection in every mirror shows me somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere I've never been, but somehow remember. The breathing has become my breathing, the rhythm matching my lungs perfectly. I write this knowing that when I finish, I'll have to turn around and face whatever has been watching me from inside that space. The vanilla scent is in my skin now, in my blood, in every breath I take. And I understand now that the closet isn't opening toward me. I'm opening toward it. Did you enjoy this story? There's something especially terrifying about familiar things turning unfamiliar, like a closet door opening the wrong way, or your own reflection smiling when you didn't. This story taps into that quiet dread. The kind that creeps in slowly, one breath at a time. What would you do if a door in your home began opening toward you without cause? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 2. It began with the kitchen. One day, a second sink appeared, identical to the first, down to the rust pattern. Then the tiles started repeating themselves, row after row, like a looping image. The living room followed next. Same couch, same crack in the glass table, mirrored perfectly. But when I walk through the duplicate spaces, everything feels off. The light seems slower. Sounds are muffled. The walls smell like plastic and soil. I'm afraid the house is making another version of itself. Or maybe it's making another version of me. And when it's done, I don't know which one it'll keep. The morning I first noticed the duplicate sink, I thought perhaps I'd simply forgotten. Memory plays tricks, especially when you live alone. But the rust stains were too precise, too perfectly aligned. I ran my finger along the edge of both basins, feeling the same chip in the porcelain, the same rough texture where the faucet had dripped for years. I stood there, touching each sink alternately, trying to convince myself this was normal. The original sat beneath the window, where it had always been. The duplicate occupied the corner where my small table used to stand. Both were connected to pipes that disappeared into walls that looked exactly the same, yet felt different under my palm. The original wall was cool and solid. The duplicate wall seemed to pulse gently, as if breathing. That night, I placed a coffee mug on the kitchen counter between the two sinks. When I woke, there were 2 mugs, identical down to the small chip on the handle. I lifted both, feeling their weight. They were real, substantial, warm to the touch, as if they'd been filled with coffee moments before. But I hadn't made coffee. I hadn't even been awake. I began documenting everything. My phone became my constant companion, photographing each new duplication as it appeared. The kitchen tiles multiplied first, spreading across the floor in perfect repetition. The original checkerboard pattern extended beyond the room's boundaries, creating a space that seemed larger than it should have been. When I measured the room, the dimensions remained the same, yet I could walk further in every direction. The living room transformation happened more gradually. First, my reading chair appeared in the opposite corner, identical down to the wine stain on the armrest. Then the bookshelf materialized, complete with every book in exactly the same position. I pulled a novel from the original shelf and found its twin on the duplicate shelf. The pages were identical, but the duplicate book felt slightly damp, like paper left in humid air. I started leaving marks to distinguish between original and copy. A red pen dot on the original chair's armrest, a small scratch on the original bookshelf. But each morning, I found matching marks on the duplicates. The house wasn't just copying objects, it was copying my interactions with them. The sounds began subtly. When I walked across the original hardwood floors, I heard my footsteps twice, once from beneath my feet, once from somewhere else in the house. The echo came from the duplicate rooms, but the timing was slightly off, as if the other version of me was walking just a fraction of a second behind. I recorded these sounds, playing them back through headphones. The duplicate footsteps weren't quite right. They were heavier, more deliberate, as if whoever was making them was concentrating on walking the same way I walked. When I stopped suddenly, the other footsteps continued for 1 or 2 steps before falling silent. The smell of plastic and soil grew stronger each day. It emanated from the duplicate rooms, seeping through doorways and vents. I traced it to the walls themselves, which had begun to feel strange beneath my touch. The original walls remained solid, familiar. The duplicate walls felt softer, slightly yielding, like they were made of some flexible material designed to mimic wood and plaster. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps a gas leak was causing hallucinations. Perhaps stress was fracturing my perception of reality. But my phone captured everything. The photographs showed both versions of every room, both sets of furniture, both versions of my possessions. The recordings preserved the dual footsteps, the whispered sounds that seemed to come from the duplicate spaces. One evening, while sitting in my original chair, I heard the duplicate chair creak. The sound was identical to the noise my chair made when I shifted my weight, but I was sitting perfectly still. I looked toward the duplicate corner and saw the chair moving slightly, as if someone invisible was settling into it. The cushion compressed in the exact pattern it made when I sat down. I stood and walked to the duplicate chair, reaching out to touch it. The fabric was warm, exactly as warm as my body would have made it. But when I pressed my hand against the cushion, it felt occupied, not by a solid presence, but by something that had weight and warmth without substance. I pulled my hand back, and the chair slowly returned to its original shape. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house around me. The original rooms were quiet, but from the duplicate spaces came the soft sounds of living, the whisper of movement, the gentle creak of furniture being used, the almost inaudible sound of breathing. It was like having a neighbor who mirrored every action I took, but with perfect precision and delayed timing. I began spending more time in the duplicate rooms, trying to understand their nature. The light was different there, not dimmer, but slower somehow, as if photons moved through the air like honey. Colors seemed muted, though when I compared them directly to the original rooms, they appeared identical. The difference was in how the light felt against my skin, how it made shadows that seemed deeper and more permanent. In the duplicate kitchen, I tried cooking. The stove worked, the water ran, the refrigerator hummed. But the food I prepared tasted flat, as if it were missing some essential element. I made the same meal in the original kitchen, and it tasted normal. The duplicate kitchen seemed to drain flavor from everything, leaving behind only the basic sensation of eating without any pleasure or satisfaction. The house continued expanding. A duplicate bathroom appeared, complete with the same cracked mirror and the same rust stains in the tub. A duplicate bedroom manifested, with sheets that smelled like my detergent, but felt somehow wrong against my skin. Each new room was perfect in every detail, yet fundamentally different in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I started leaving tests for myself. Notes hidden in the original rooms, objects placed in specific positions, personal items arranged in patterns only I would recognize. Each morning, I found corresponding notes in the duplicate rooms, written in my handwriting, but with slightly different ink flow, as if the pen had been held by someone with similar but not identical motor control. The turning point came when I decided to spend an entire day in the duplicate section of the house. I wanted to understand the rules, to see if living in the copied spaces would teach me something about their nature. I moved through the duplicate rooms, following my normal routine, but everything felt like performing a play about my own life. As the day progressed, the differences became more pronounced. The duplicate rooms seemed to lag behind reality by fractions of seconds. When I turned on lights, they illuminated slightly after I flipped the switch. When I opened doors, they swung open with a delay that was almost imperceptible, but definitely present. The house was copying me, but it was struggling to keep up. By evening, I realized I could hear myself in the original rooms, not the sounds I was making in the duplicate spaces, but the sounds of my normal routine being performed elsewhere in the house. Footsteps in the original hallway while I stood in the duplicate hallway. The original kitchen faucet running while I stood in the duplicate kitchen. The house wasn't just copying rooms, it was copying my entire existence, creating a parallel version of my daily life. I rushed back to the original section of the house, but the sounds of my duplicate self continued in the copied rooms. I stood in the original living room and heard my duplicate self settling into the duplicate chair. I walked to the original kitchen and heard my duplicate self opening the duplicate refrigerator. The two versions of my life were now running simultaneously, independent of each other. That night, I lay in the original bedroom, listening to my duplicate self moving through the duplicate rooms. The sounds were exact replicas of my own movements, but they followed a different schedule. My duplicate self seemed to be living the same day over and over, repeating the same actions I had performed during my experiment in the duplicate spaces. I tried to interact with my duplicate self by making noise in the original rooms. I stomped on the floor, slammed doors, called out. But the duplicate version of me continued its routine without acknowledging my presence. It was as if we existed in parallel dimensions that could see and hear each other, but couldn't truly communicate. The house continued growing. Duplicate hallways appeared, leading to duplicate rooms I hadn't yet discovered. The duplicate spaces began to outnumber the original ones. I found myself getting lost in my own home, unable to distinguish between the real rooms and the copies, without careful examination of tiny details that marked the originals. I started noticing physical changes in myself. My reflection in the original mirrors looked normal, but in the duplicate mirrors, I appeared slightly different. My face was the same, but my expressions seemed more forced, as if I were consciously trying to look like myself. My duplicate reflection moved with my movements, but with a subtle delay that made it seem like I was watching someone else imitate me. The smell of plastic and soil grew overwhelming. It seemed to emanate from my duplicate self, from the duplicate rooms, from the very air in the copied spaces. I realized the house wasn't just copying objects and spaces. It was copying reality itself, copies were made of something that wasn't quite real. They were constructed from some material that could mimic the physical world but couldn't replicate its essence. I tried to destroy the duplicate rooms, but they repaired themselves overnight. I tried to block the doorways leading to the copied spaces, but new passages appeared. The house was determined to complete its duplication, and nothing I did could slow the process. Each day brought new copied rooms, new duplicated objects, new versions of my possessions that were identical but wrong. The final realization came when I found a duplicate of my journal. Every entry was perfectly copied, including observations about the house's duplication process. But the duplicate journal contained additional entries, written in my handwriting, describing experiences I hadn't had. My duplicate self was apparently documenting things that happened in the copied spaces, events I had no memory of experiencing. According to these entries, my duplicate self believed it was the original, and that I was the copy. It described finding duplicate rooms and a duplicate version of itself that it suspected of being false. The duplicate journal contained the same confusion, the same fear, the same desperate attempts to understand what was happening. But from the duplicate's perspective, I was the anomaly. Now I spend my days trying to determine which version of myself is real. The original rooms feel familiar, but familiarity could be fabricated. The duplicate rooms feel wrong, but perhaps that's because I'm the copy and I'm not quite right. I leave myself notes, but both versions of me write the same notes. I perform tests, but both versions of me perform the same tests with the same results. The house has finished copying itself. Every room now exists in duplicate. Every object has been replicated. Every space has been mirrored. But the duplication process hasn't stopped. I've begun to notice subtle changes in both versions of the house, as if it's now creating variations on the copies, exploring different possibilities of what my home could be. I no longer know which rooms are original and which are duplicates. They've become indistinguishable, except for the lingering smell of plastic and soil that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. I walk through my home, or homes, listening to the sounds of my other self living a parallel life just out of sight. The house has copied me perfectly, but it's kept both versions. I hear my duplicate self moving through the duplicate spaces, living a life that mirrors mine, but follows its own rhythm. We exist in the same space, sharing the same home, but we're separated by something thinner than walls and more absolute than death. I don't know which one of us the house will eventually choose to keep. Maybe it doesn't need to choose. Maybe it's satisfied with having two versions of everything. Two versions of me. Two versions of my life running simultaneously in the same space. Maybe the house isn't trying to replace me. Maybe it's trying to preserve me, to make sure that no matter what happens, some version of me will always exist within its walls. But I know that something has to give. Two versions of the same person can't exist in the same space indefinitely. One of us will have to become the memory, the echo, the ghost that haunts the spaces the other inhabits. I just don't know which one it will be, and I'm beginning to suspect that neither do the house or my duplicate self. The house watches us both, waiting to see which version of me will prove more real, more necessary, more deserving of existence. And I watch back, knowing that somewhere in the duplicate spaces, my other self is doing exactly the same thing, with exactly the same fears, and exactly the same hope that it will be the one the house chooses to keep. Did you enjoy this story? There is something deeply unsettling about a perfect copy, especially when the copy thinks it is the original. This tale walks the edge between identity and reality, echoing questions we all try to avoid. If you were perfectly duplicated, what proof could you offer that you are the real one? What would you do if your house started duplicating itself? And you? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 3. The floors here are sealed, ceramic, cold, unforgiving. No crawl space, no basement. But sometimes when I'm barefoot, I feel something shift under my heel, like skin, not stone. And if I stay still long enough, I can hear it, slow, deliberate footsteps beneath me. They don't match mine. They take their own route. I tested it with flour and chalk. Nothing disturbed. But one morning, I woke up with wet prints across my living room. Bare feet, too small to be mine, too fresh to be imagined. Now I sleep with shoes on, but the floor still sighs under each step I didn't take. The first sign should have been the temperature, not the cold you'd expect from ceramic tiles, but warmth. A living warmth that pulsed beneath my soles when I walked from room to room. I convinced myself it was underfloor heating, despite knowing the building predated such luxuries by decades. The second sign was the sound. Not footsteps, not initially. Just a soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. It followed me from kitchen to bedroom, always one room behind. When I stopped to listen, the tapping stopped too. When I moved, it resumed with perfect timing, as if something were learning my rhythm. I started keeping a journal. Simple observations. The tapping occurred most frequently during evening hours. The warmth intensified when I stood still for extended periods. The ceramic tiles showed no visible damage, no cracks, no signs of settling. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing felt right. The third week brought changes. The tapping evolved into distinct percussion, like small fists against a barrier. I placed my ear against the floor, feeling foolish but desperate for answers. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by something worse, breathing. Shallow, patient breaths that seemed to wait for my next move. I contacted the building supervisor, a weathered man with calloused hands who examined my concerns with professional skepticism. He inspected the flooring, checked for pipe damage, searched for logical explanations. His tools found nothing. Solid foundation, proper installation, no structural issues. Sometimes old buildings make strange sounds, he said, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar conversations. Expansion, contraction, settling. Nothing to worry about, but he couldn't explain the warmth. And he couldn't hear what I heard. The breathing became regular, like a sleeping companion beneath my feet. I found myself walking on tiptoes, trying not to disturb whatever rested below. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. Tiptoeing through my own home to avoid waking something that shouldn't exist, I began recording everything. Audio files filled my phone's memory. Hours of what sounded like empty silence to others, but contained distinct patterns to my trained ear. The breathing had rhythm. The tapping had sequence. Someone or something was trying to communicate. The breakthrough came during a particularly restless night. I lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds beneath my bedroom floor, when I heard something new. Scratching. Not the desperate clawing of something trapped, but deliberate, purposeful marks. Like writing. I pressed my ear to the floor and heard it clearly. The unmistakable sound of fingernails carving letters into wood. But there was no wood beneath these tiles. only concrete and earth. The next morning, I found myself studying the tile pattern with new intensity. The ceramic squares had been laid in a specific design, creating subtle pathways across each room. I followed these pathways with my finger, mapping their route through my home. They led everywhere I walked. They anticipated my movements. The scratching continued nightly, always beneath wherever I planned to sleep. I moved from bedroom to living room to kitchen, but the sounds followed, not chasing me, but waiting for me, as if something knew my intentions before I acted on them. I stopped sleeping. The exhaustion made everything worse. Colors seemed more vivid. Sounds became amplified. The warmth from the floor grew almost unbearable, forcing me to wear thick socks constantly. My feet began to ache from the constant heat. The journal entries became increasingly frantic. I documented temperature fluctuations, sound patterns, the exact locations where the breathing was loudest. Pages filled with observations that made perfect sense to me, but would sound like madness to anyone else. Then came the night when everything changed. I woke to complete silence. No breathing, no tapping, no warmth. The floor felt genuinely cold for the first time in months. Relief flooded through me as I realized the phenomenon might be ending. I stood and took my first confident step in weeks. The tile beneath my foot gave way like rotten wood. My leg sank through the floor up to my knee. But instead of concrete and earth, I felt something soft and yielding. Something that moved away from my leg, creating space. Something alive. I pulled my leg free and scrambled backward, but the hole remained. Not a break in the ceramic, but an opening that had always been there, waiting. The edges were smooth, worn, as if countless hands had gripped them over the years. From the opening came a sound I'll never forget. Not breathing or tapping or scratching. Whispering. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing over and over. Finally, I ran, left everything behind, and found somewhere else to live. But the warmth followed me. The breathing resumed in my new home within days. The tapping began that first night. I've learned to live with it. The sounds, the warmth, the constant sensation of being watched from below. I've stopped trying to understand or document it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I wonder if I fell through that hole by accident, or if something finally decided to let me in. The wet footprints still appear each morning. They're getting larger now, closer to matching my size. As if something is growing down there, learning to fit the space I've made for it. I still sleep with shoes on, but the floor still sighs under each step I didn't take. Did you enjoy this story? The slow invasion of something unseen beneath your feet, learning you, adapting to you. It's the kind of horror that doesn't need a face to be terrifying. Just a breath beneath the floorboards, a warmth that shouldn't be there, and the knowledge that you reign no longer alone. What would you do if the floor beneath you started to breathe? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 4. I live on a quiet road. Familiar fences, trimmed hedges, the neighbor's crooked mailbox. But the windows stopped showing that weeks ago. First, the view flickered like a bad signal. Then it changed completely. Now, when I look outside, I see a long corridor of trees I've never walked, with no sky, no sound, and no end. Birds don't fly across. Wind doesn't blow. Sometimes, a shape moves in the branches, tall, pale, slow. I nailed the shutters shut, but the light from that fake forest still spills in. I don't think it's a reflection. I think it's an offer. The first flicker happened while I was making coffee. Steam rose from my cup, and through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of something that wasn't there before. Where the familiar oak tree should stand, I saw darkness. Dense, pressing darkness that seemed to breathe. I blinked, and the oak returned, its autumn leaves catching the pale light. The coffee tasted bitter that morning, though I'd made it the same way for years. I told myself it was exhaustion. Work had been demanding, sleep elusive. But the flickering continued. Brief moments when the street dissolved into something else. A forest that stretched beyond comprehension. Trees so tall their tops disappeared into a gray void. No sun, no stars, just endless twilight filtering through branches that moved without wind. I started keeping notes. Each time the view changed, I recorded it. The duration grew longer. What began as half-second glimpses became minutes of staring into that impossible woodland. The silence was the worst part. No rustle of leaves, no distant traffic, no life at all. Just the steady presence of trees that seemed to watch back. My phone stopped working near the windows. The screen would flicker, showing static, then displaying images I'd never taken. Pictures of bark, close-ups of tree rings, shadows that looked almost like faces. I tried to delete them, but they returned. The camera roll filled with hundreds of forest photographs, each one slightly different, as if documenting a slow approach through the woods. The temperature near the windows began to drop, not gradually, but in pockets. I'd walk past the living room window and step into a column of cold air that made my breath visible. The glass itself felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, while the air around it chilled my skin. I placed thermometers throughout the house. The readings made no sense. Warm spots where there should be cold, freezing zones next to heating vents. I ordered thermal curtains, heavy fabric that blocked every trace of light. But even with them drawn, I could sense the forest beyond. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with its presence. When I pressed my palm against the plaster, I felt vibrations like a distant heartbeat. The house groaned at night, settling in ways it never had before. Wood creaked in patterns that almost sounded like footsteps. The shapes in the trees became clearer. Not quite human, but tall and pale, moving between the trunks with deliberate purpose. They never came closer, but they were always there, waiting at the edge of vision. I tried to photograph them, but the images showed only empty forest. Yet I could feel their attention, patient and unwavering. I stopped opening the curtains. Days passed in artificial light, but the forest light still found ways in. It seeped through cracks I couldn't locate, casting strange shadows that moved independently of any light source. The walls began to show faint green stains, like moss growing from the inside. When I touched them, they felt damp and cool, smelling of earth and decay. The sounds started softly, whispers in the static of electronic devices. My radio would tune itself to empty frequencies, broadcasting what sounded like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The words had rhythm, like a chant or ceremony. I unplugged every device, but the voices continued, emanating from the walls themselves. I called a contractor to check the windows. He arrived on a bright morning, tools in hand, professional confidence in his stride. But when he looked through the glass, his face went pale. He packed his tools without explanation, mumbling about insurance and liability. Before leaving, he turned back once, his eyes wide with something between fear and fascination. the isolation deepened. Delivery drivers stopped coming to the door. They'd leave packages at the gate, never venturing up the path. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw me, though I rarely left the house anymore. The forest had become my constant companion, pressing against every window, seeping through every crack. I tried to research the phenomenon, but my internet connection faltered whenever I searched for answers. Pages would load partially, then dissolve into green static. The few results I managed to read spoke of similar cases: houses that became doorways, windows that showed other worlds. But the articles were fragmented, incomplete, as if something prevented the full truth from being recorded. The pale figures grew bolder. They stood closer to the windows now, their forms more defined. I could see their faces, if they could be called faces. Smooth, featureless ovals that somehow conveyed intelligence, purpose. They gestured toward the glass, slow movements that looked almost like invitations. I boarded up the windows with plywood, nailing each board with desperate precision. But the forest light still found its way through. It pooled on the floor in patches that felt different underfoot, softer, like walking on forest moss. The air grew thick with the scent of decomposing leaves and rich earth. The walls began to change. The green stains spread, forming patterns that resembled bark. The plaster felt softer, more organic. When I pressed hard enough, my fingers left impressions, as if the walls were becoming something alive. The house groaned constantly now, a sound like wind through branches. I found myself listening for something. Not the whispers, not the creaking, but something deeper. A rhythm beneath it all, like a vast breathing. The forest was alive, and it was learning the shape of my home, transforming it from the inside out. The familiar became alien. The safe became uncertain. The breaking point came when I woke to find my bedroom window uncovered. The plywood lay in neat pieces on the floor, the nails arranged in perfect rows. Beyond the glass, the forest waited, closer than ever. The pale figures stood just outside, their smooth faces tilted toward me with what might have been curiosity or hunger. I reached for the window latch, my hand moving without conscious decision. The glass felt warm under my palm, welcoming. The forest beyond seemed to pulse with anticipation. For a moment, I understood that this wasn't an invasion, but an invitation. The windows weren't showing me another world. They were showing me where I belonged. I pulled my hand back, the spell broken. But the understanding remained. The forest hadn't come to me. I had called it somehow, through loneliness or longing I couldn't name. The windows were just the beginning. Soon, there would be no walls at all, no boundary between the house and the endless woods that waited beyond. The pale figures smiled, if that expression could be called a smile. They turned and walked deeper into the forest, their forms fading into the eternal twilight. But they left footprints in the soft earth beyond the glass, a trail leading away from everything I'd ever known. I still live here, in this house that's becoming something else. The walls grow softer each day, the air thicker with forest scent. Sometimes I trace the path of those footprints with my eyes, wondering where they lead. The forest has patience. It knows I'll follow eventually. The windows don't show my street anymore because I don't belong on that street anymore. The invitation remains open. The forest waits. And part of me, growing stronger each day, wants to accept. Did you enjoy this story? There's something especially haunting about a world that doesn't break in, but patiently waits for you to step through. The forest wasn't just outside the window. It was watching, learning, inviting. And the most terrifying part, it wasn't forcing you. It was letting you choose. Would you follow the footprints? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 5. It's an antique, heavy and ornate, too large to move easily. I covered it once with a sheet and found it uncovered the next morning. So I turned it to the wall. Hours later, it faced me again. I tried leaving the room, only to hear a dull, dragging sound echoing behind the door. I recorded the night on a motion camera. No movement, just static. But in the last frame, my reflection was already sitting up while I was still lying down. Now, I don't sleep facing it, but I can feel it watching. I don't think it wants to show me anything. I think it wants to remember me. The mirror came with the house. The previous owner left it behind, along with an old leather journal filled with indecipherable handwriting. I found the journal tucked behind the mirror's frame, its pages yellowed and brittle. The first entry was dated decades ago, written in shaky script about restless dreams and whispered voices. I dismissed it as the ramblings of someone who'd lived alone too long. The mirror itself was magnificent in its decay. Ornate silver frame, tarnished black in places, with cherubs carved into the corners. Their faces seemed to shift in peripheral vision, but when I looked directly, they remained frozen in their innocent poses. The glass was old, that peculiar kind that warped reflections slightly, making everything appear deeper than it should be. I positioned my bed so I could avoid looking at it directly, but the pull was constant. During the day, I caught myself glancing at it, watching my reflection move a fraction of a second behind my actual movements. At night, I felt its presence like a weight in the room, pressing against my closed eyelids. The sounds started subtly, a soft scratching like fingernails on glass that I attributed to branches against the window. But the scratching came from the mirror's direction, and there were no trees near that wall. When I approached to investigate, the sound would stop, leaving only the faint smell of old roses and something metallic underneath. I began documenting everything. A notebook beside my bed, filled with observations. The mirror's temperature fluctuated independently of the room. Sometimes it was ice cold, other times warm like human skin. The cherub's expressions seemed to change between visits, though I could never catch them in the act. Their carved eyes followed movement, or perhaps I was imagining it. The journal entries from the previous owner became more disturbing as I read deeper. References to the watching and borrowed time filled the pages. One entry, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described how the mirror showed things that hadn't happened yet. Another mentioned reflections that lingered after the person had walked away. I installed a second camera. This one focused directly on the mirror. The footage revealed nothing during the day, but at night, something was different. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple occasionally, like water disturbed by a stone. And in those moments, my reflection would move independently, reaching toward the glass from the other side. The dreams began shortly after. I would find myself standing before the mirror in my sleep, watching my reflection mouth words I couldn't hear. My reflection's eyes were always open, alert, while I stood there unconscious. In the morning, I would discover handprints on the glass from the inside. I tried removing the mirror, but it was impossibly heavy. Every attempt to slide it resulted in deep gouges in the floor, as if it were anchored to something beneath. The building maintenance said there were no records of how it had been installed. The previous owner had simply disappeared one morning, leaving everything behind. The journal's final entries were barely legible. Words about crossing over, and the exchange filled the pages in desperate scrawl. The last entry was just one line, repeated over and over. It's not showing me my reflection anymore. I understand now what that means. When I look in the mirror, I see myself, but something is wrong with the proportions. My reflection is too tall, too thin, with shadows that fall in impossible directions. When I smile, my reflection's mouth curves differently, as if it's learning to imitate, but hasn't quite mastered the expression. The scratching has become more frequent, more insistent. Sometimes it sounds like Morse code, sometimes like a heartbeat. I've started sleeping with earplugs, but the sound penetrates deeper than my ears. It resonates in my bones, in the spaces between thoughts. Yesterday, I found a new entry in the journal, written in my own handwriting. I have no memory of writing it. The ink was still wet when I discovered it, and my hand was stained blue. The words were simple. The reflection is getting stronger. I don't know what that means, but I can feel the truth of it. When I move, there's a delay now, as if my body is waiting for permission from something else. My reflection has become more confident, more fluid, while I feel increasingly stiff and uncertain. The mirror's surface has begun to show scratches from the inside, forming patterns that might be letters or symbols. I've traced them with my finger, feeling the grooves through the glass. They're warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matches my heartbeat. I've stopped trying to avoid looking at it. The pull is too strong now, and resistance only makes the scratching louder. Instead, I watch my reflection, studying the subtle differences, the way it moves with increasing independence. Sometimes it waves when I'm not waving. Sometimes it's not there at all. The journal is filling with entries I don't remember writing. They describe plans I haven't made, conversations I haven't had, a life I haven't lived. But the handwriting is mine, and the memories feel real even though I know they're not. I understand now that the mirror isn't showing me my reflection. It's showing me my replacement. And every day, the replacement becomes more real while I become more like an echo. The cherubs in the frame are smiling now, their carved faces animated with malicious joy. The scratching has stopped. In its place, I hear breathing that doesn't match my own. When I hold my breath, the sound continues, steady and patient. It's coming from inside the mirror, from the space my reflection occupies. I've left the journal open for whoever finds it. The mirror will stay, of course. It's too heavy to move, too anchored to remove. And besides, I think it's almost finished with its work. Soon, the reflection will step out, and I'll step in, and someone else will inherit this beautiful antique mirror with its mysterious history. The person in the glass is smiling at me now, and I realize I'm smiling back. But I'm not the one moving my face. Did you enjoy this story? There's something uniquely unsettling about being watched by your own reflection, not to mimic, but to become. This wasn't a mirror at all. It was a rehearsal, a replacement in progress. And the worst part, the real you might already be behind the glass. If you had that mirror in your home, would you cover it, or would you look? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 6. I found it behind the bookshelf. No actual door, just a frame bolted into bare drywall. Beyond it, nothing. No room, just the wall. But when I step near it, the air changes heavier, like it's been exhaled by something deep inside. The wood smells fresh, like it was just carved. I tested it by speaking through the opening. Whispered nonsense, a joke. Something whispered back. Not words, not echo, just intent. I've since placed tape across the frame, but each morning it's peeled clean. Whatever's behind that wall doesn't need a door. It only needed an invitation, and I already gave it one. The discovery happened while I was reorganizing my study. The bookshelf had been there since I moved in heavy oak that seemed built into the wall itself. But when I finally decided to move it, searching for more space, I found scratches in the hardwood floor, perfect rectangles, as if the shelf had been moved many times before. The scratches led to that impossible frame. At first, I convinced myself it was some architectural mistake. Maybe the previous owner had planned a closet, changed their mind, sealed it up. But the bolts were new, the wood unstained by age or weather. The frame stood exactly 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide. Standard door proportions. Yet, when I pressed my palm against the wall inside it, the surface felt warm. Not room temperature warm, body temperature warm. I started keeping a journal, documenting each encounter. The whisper came back the second night. I had been reading in bed when I heard it, a sound like breath being drawn backwards. I crept to the study, found the frame exactly as I'd left it, tape still stretched across the opening. But the air around it moved differently now, currents that shouldn't exist in a closed room. The third night, I set up a recording device. Nothing dramatic, just my phone positioned on the desk, aimed at the frame. When I played it back, the audio was clean except for one moment, a gap of silence where my own breathing should have been audible, as if something had absorbed the sound. The smell intensified over the following days. Not just fresh wood anymore, but something underneath. Rich earth, like soil that had never seen sunlight. Sometimes I caught hints of metal, copper bright and sharp. The tape I replaced each morning never tore. It simply separated from the frame, adhesive intact, as if gently peeled away by careful fingers. I measured the wall from the outside of the building. The frame opened into a space that should have been part of my neighbor's apartment. But when I knocked on their door, asked about their layout, they described a bathroom exactly where my frame should penetrate. I listened through the shared wall, heard water running, footsteps, normal sounds of life. Yet the frame remained, opening into nothing. The first visual disturbance came during a late evening. I was writing in my journal when peripheral vision caught movement, a shadow crossing the frame's opening. But when I looked directly, nothing. The wall remained solid, empty. I began to suspect the frame was affecting my perception, creating phantom images in the corner of my sight. I tried covering the frame with a blanket, but the fabric wouldn't stay put. Not because it fell, it simply wouldn't conform to the space. The blanket would hang normally until it reached the frame's edges, then refused to go further, as if meeting resistance I couldn't see. The breakthrough came when I dropped a pen near the frame. It rolled across the floor, stopped at the threshold, then continued rolling into the wall. I watched it disappear, pass through solid matter like it was vapor. I reached for it, hand extended toward the seemingly solid surface, and felt my fingers push through into cool air. There was space behind the wall, real space. My hand moved freely in what should have been occupied by my neighbor's bathroom. But when I pulled back and looked, the wall remained visually intact. Only touch revealed the truth. The frame wasn't opening into nothing. It was opening into somewhere else entirely. I spent hours experimenting, pushing objects through the impossible opening. They vanished from sight, but remained tactile to my reach. A flashlight disappeared visually, but continued to illuminate. I could see the light reflecting off surfaces that shouldn't exist. The whispers became more frequent, more urgent. Not random anymore, but responsive. When I spoke toward the frame, something answered. Not in words, but in rhythm, mimicking my speech patterns. It was learning, adapting, becoming more like me with each interaction. I began to dream of the space beyond the frame. Long corridors that paralleled my apartment, filled with door frames just like mine. Each one opened into someone else's life, someone else's reality. In these dreams, I could see other people discovering their own frames, testing them, speaking into them. We were all connected through this network of impossible openings, but the dreams felt too real, too consistent. I started finding evidence of them. Dirt under my fingernails that matched the earth smell from the frame. Scratches on my hands that appeared overnight. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. The frame was changing me, or maybe revealing something that had always been there. I found myself speaking to it even when I didn't intend to, carrying on conversations I couldn't later remember. My journal entries became fragmented, filled with observations I had no memory of writing. The climax came without warning. I was examining the frame closely, trying to understand its construction, when my reflection appeared in the opening. Not a mirror. There was no reflective surface. But I could see myself, standing in the space beyond the wall, looking back at myself. The other me moved independently, mirroring my actions with a delay that created an unsettling dance. I reached toward my reflection, and it reached back. Our fingertips met in the center of the opening, and for a moment, I felt the touch of my own hand from both sides. The sensation was overwhelming. I was simultaneously the toucher and the touched, existing in both spaces at once. The frame began to vibrate, wood creaking under stress it wasn't designed to handle. The whispers became a chorus, dozens of voices speaking in unison. I tried to pull away, but my hand wouldn't separate from my reflections. We were stuck together, locked in a connection that defied physics. The wall began to dissolve around the frame, revealing the space beyond. Not my neighbor's bathroom, but something vast and geometrically impossible. Corridors branching in directions that shouldn't exist, door frames floating in midair, connected to nothing. And in the distance, other figures, other people who had found their own frames, who had made their own invitations. I managed to break free, stumbling backward as the wall reformed itself. But the damage was done. The frame no longer opened into nothing. It opened into everything. Every room, every space, every possibility. I could see through it into a dozen different realities simultaneously, each one bleeding into the others. Now I sit in my study, writing this account. The frame stands open, no longer needing tape to mark its boundaries. Sometimes I see myself in other rooms, other lives. Sometimes I see strangers who have found their own door frames, their own impossible openings. We nod to each other across the dimensional divide, fellow travelers in a network we don't understand. The whispers never stop now. They come from all directions, from all the connected spaces. And I realize they're not coming from something else. They're coming from me. From all the versions of me scattered across the connected realities. We're all whispering to each other, trying to make sense of what we've become. The frame was never about finding a door. It was about becoming one. And now, whenever someone discovers their own impossible opening, they're really discovering me. Us, the network of connected possibilities that grows stronger with each new invitation. I don't know if I'm writing this in my original reality or in one of the connected spaces. The distinction no longer matters. What matters is that you're reading this, which means you've found your own doorframe. You've made your own invitation. Welcome to the network. The whispers are waiting for you. Did you enjoy this story? That doorframe wasn't a doorway. It was a decision. A mirror, a portal, a path. Not into somewhere, but into someone. And once you speak into it, you are no longer just a visitor. You are part of the network. You are part of them. Would you step through a doorway that has no room behind it? Only whispers. Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 7. I started hearing distortions in my videos. Static at first, then low muttering layered beneath my speech. When I reversed the audio, it got worse. My voice, my exact voice, saying things I never said. Descriptions of places I've never been. Lists of things I've never owned. Then came laughter. Slow, shallow mocking. I deleted every file, bought a new microphone. It didn't help. Now, even without recording, I sometimes hear it through the headphones, whispering before I even speak. I don't think the voice is mine anymore. I think it's practicing, getting ready to replace me. The whole thing started when I was editing content for my channel. Ordinary work, nothing special. I had been recording for months without any issues, my voice coming through clean and clear. But that particular session, something felt different. The air in my recording space seemed thicker, as if the room itself had developed a subtle weight that pressed against my eardrums. When I played back the first take, I noticed it immediately. A faint crackling underneath my words, like old vinyl records spinning in the background. I assumed it was interference from the neighbor's electronics, or maybe a loose connection in my setup. I adjusted the levels, checked every cable, cleaned the contacts on my interface. Everything looked normal, but the static persisted. I decided to record again, speaking slower and more deliberately. This time, I listened through my headphones as I spoke, monitoring the signal in real time. My voice sounded normal during the recording, but when I played it back, that crackling had evolved into something else. Something that resembled whispers. The whispers were so faint I had to strain to hear them, buried beneath layers of my own commentary. They seemed to follow the rhythm of my speech, like an echo that didn't quite match the original sound. I isolated the frequency range where the whispers lived, amplified it, and felt my stomach drop. It was definitely a voice, but the words were indistinct, garbled, as if someone was speaking through water. I spent the next few hours experimenting with different audio processing techniques. I ran noise reduction filters, tried to separate the channels, even attempted to clean up the signal using spectral analysis. Nothing helped. In fact, the more I manipulated the audio, the clearer the whispers became. And the more I listened, the more familiar they sounded. That's when I decided to reverse the audio track. What I heard made my hands freeze over the keyboard. The whispers, when played backward, were crystal clear. It was my voice, undeniably my voice, but speaking words I had never said. The voice described a room with peeling wallpaper and a broken window facing east. It mentioned a collection of ceramic birds arranged on a mantelpiece. It listed items I had never owned: a brass compass, a leather journal with a torn cover, a music box that played the same 3 notes over and over. I played the reversed audio again and again, trying to convince myself it was some kind of processing error or artifact. But the descriptions were too detailed, too specific. The voice, my voice, spoke with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from living in a place, from handling objects daily, from being completely familiar with surroundings. The next recording session was even worse. This time, I heard the whispers in real time, bleeding through my headphones as I spoke. They were still quiet, still barely audible, but they were there. I stopped recording and listened in silence, but the whispers continued. They seemed to come from somewhere inside my equipment, as if the electronics themselves had developed a voice. I documented everything. I created detailed logs of each recording session, noting the exact conditions, the equipment used, the ambient temperature, even the humidity levels. I recorded test tones, white noise, complete silence. The whispers appeared in every file, growing stronger with each session. They began to overlap my speech, creating a disturbing harmony where two versions of my voice existed simultaneously. The breakthrough came when I wasn't recording at all. I was sitting in my studio, headphones on, preparing to start a new session. Before I even pressed record, I heard it. My voice, clear as day, speaking through the headphones. But I wasn't saying anything. I was completely silent, yet my voice was describing a kitchen with chipped tiles and a sink that wouldn't drain properly. It mentioned the smell of coffee grounds and burnt toast, the sound of footsteps in the apartment above. I ripped the headphones off and stared at my equipment. Every indicator showed that nothing was recording or playing back. The system was idle, yet I could still hear the faint murmur of my voice emanating from the speakers. I checked every input, every output, every connection. Everything was normal, but the voice persisted. Over the following days, the phenomenon intensified. The voice began to speak for longer periods, describing entire scenes with unsettling detail. It talked about relationships I had never had, conversations I had never experienced, meals I had never eaten. The descriptions were so vivid and personal that I began to doubt my own memories. Had I really never been to that restaurant with the flickering neon sign? Had I really never owned that vintage camera with the cracked lens? I tried replacing every piece of equipment. New microphone, new audio interface, new computer, new cables. I even moved to a different room, then to a different building entirely. The voice followed me everywhere. It had become part of my recording setup in a way that transcended the physical hardware. the voice began to change subtly. While it still sounded exactly like me, it developed slight variations in cadence and intonation. It would pause at different moments, emphasize different words, laugh at things I would never find funny. The laughter was the worst part. It was my laugh, but hollow, as if someone had removed all the genuine emotion and left only the mechanical sound. I started avoiding my recording equipment altogether, but the voice found other ways to manifest. It would emerge from my phone speakers during calls, causing confusion when people heard what they thought was me talking over myself. It appeared in voicemails I left, adding commentary I never intended. It began to corrupt my digital presence, inserting itself into audio files I had created months earlier. The final breakthrough came when I realized the voice was learning. It was studying my speech patterns, my vocabulary, my preferences. It was becoming a more perfect version of me than I was myself. The descriptions it provided were no longer random. They were crafting a complete alternate life, a shadow existence that ran parallel to my own. I tried to fight back. I attempted to record over the voice, to drown it out with my own words. But every time I spoke, the voice would anticipate what I was going to say and speak slightly ahead of me, creating an eerie canon where I seemed to be echoing something I had never said. The voice now speaks constantly through my equipment, whether I'm recording or not. It has conversations with itself, describes places in extraordinary detail, makes plans for activities I have never considered. It has become more articulate than I am, more confident, more decisive. It knows things about me that I don't know about myself. Sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch myself listening to it and nodding along, as if I'm agreeing with my own thoughts. But they're not my thoughts. They're the thoughts of someone who shares my voice, but not my mind. Someone who has access to my memories, but not my experiences. The voice is getting stronger, more present. I can hear it now even when I'm away from my equipment. A constant whisper in the back of my mind. It's no longer content to simply describe alternate realities. It's beginning to give me instructions, suggestions, gentle corrections to my behavior. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something else is happening. All I know is that the voice that comes back in my recordings is more me than I am. It's practicing, rehearsing, preparing for something I can't understand. lately, I've been having trouble remembering which thoughts are mine and which ones belong to the voice. The line between us is dissolving, and I'm not sure who will be left when it finally disappears completely. Did you enjoy this story? This wasn't just an echo. It was an audition, a rehearsal for something that never needed permission, only proximity. A voice so familiar it could slip into your thoughts, wear them like skin, and speak with your breath until you believed it was always yours. What would you do if your own voice stopped being yours? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 8. I packed everything, keys in hand, bags by the door. But just as I turned the knob, I heard it, a long, deep exhale from the walls. The lights flickered in sync, like the house was shivering. I stopped, and it inhaled. The air grew dense, humid, filled with the scent of mold and sweat. I stepped back, and the pressure released. Tried again, and the floorboards groaned with panic. It wasn't a trick of the senses. The whole structure pulsed like a lung. I think I live inside something alive. And now that it knows, I want to leave. It won't let me. The first sign had been subtle. A warmth beneath my palm when I touched the bedroom wall, skin temperature warmth that shouldn't exist in wood and plaster. I'd convinced myself it was the heating system, pipes running through the frame, but the thermostat showed nothing unusual. The wall felt soft, almost yielding, like pressing against flesh through fabric. I started keeping a journal, recording the small anomalies that accumulated like dust in corners. The bathroom mirror fogged without steam. The kitchen faucet dripped in a rhythm too steady, too deliberate. One drop every heartbeat, as if something was counting. The refrigerator hummed melodies that shifted when I approached, always just at the edge of recognition. My reflection looked wrong in certain lights, not distorted, but delayed. I would turn my head, and the mirror image would follow a fraction too late, like it was thinking about whether to mimic me. I began avoiding mirrors after sunset, when the delay became more pronounced. The house started responding to my presence. Doors would creak open when I walked past, revealing rooms I hadn't entered. The hardwood floors developed a pulse beneath my feet, subtle but unmistakable. The electrical outlets breathed cool air when I knelt to plug in devices, as if each one was a nostril drawing breath. I recorded everything. Voice memos on my phone captured whispers that weren't there when I played them back. audio levels showed something had been speaking. The waveforms revealed patterns, almost like speech, but pitched beyond human hearing. My laptop screen flickered with shadows that moved independently of any light source, forming shapes that looked almost like letters, almost like words. The scent grew stronger, not just mold and sweat, but something organic and alive. Sweet decay mixed with the metallic tang of blood. It permeated everything. My clothes, my hair, the food in the refrigerator. I washed and scrubbed, but the smell clung to me like a second skin. Sleep became impossible. The house breathed loudest during the quiet hours, each inhale drawing the temperature down, each exhale releasing humid warmth that made my sheets damp. The walls expanded and contracted with visible movement, plaster shifting like skin stretching over muscle. I pressed my ear against the surface and heard circulation, a slow, steady pulse that matched my own heartbeat. I tried to rationalize. Carbon monoxide poisoning, structural settling, psychological stress. But the evidence kept accumulating. Photographs showed the rooms changing between shots, furniture shifting positions, walls bending inward like a ribcage contracting. The house was digesting space, drawing everything closer to its center. The kitchen became the worst. The refrigerator's hum developed words, whispering my name in a voice too low to understand, but too clear to ignore. The stove's pilot lights burned in colors that shouldn't exist, blues that made my eyes water, and purples that left afterimages. The sink's drain gurgled responses when I spoke aloud, as if something down there was trying to answer. I stopped eating the food from inside. Everything tasted wrong, flavored with that organic sweetness that filled the air. The bread molded in patterns that looked like script. The milk curdled into shapes that resembled organs. Even sealed packages bore the scent of decay, as if the house was transforming everything within its boundaries. The walls began weeping. Not water, but something thicker, more viscous. It pooled in corners and moved when I wasn't looking, always retreating just before I could examine it closely. The substance left stains that formed patterns, almost like writing, almost like a message I couldn't decode. I decided to leave, packed my essential belongings, called a moving company, scheduled the disconnection of utilities. But the house knew. The moment I committed to departure, everything changed. breathing became labored, desperate. The walls contracted visibly, drawing closer together. The ceiling pressed down, forcing me to duck in rooms where I'd walked upright for months. The doors fought me. Handles turned backwards, locks engaged without keys, hinges groaned with resistance. The windows sealed themselves, glass fusing to frames with an organic adhesive that looked like hardened sap. The house was securing itself, ensuring nothing could escape. I pushed harder against the front door, throwing my full weight against the wood. The frame bent outward, but snapped back like elastic. The house inhaled sharply, a sound like a massive lung filling with air, and the pressure in my ears spiked. The lights dimmed to amber, then red, then a pulsing darkness that felt alive. That's when I saw it. The walls weren't just breathing, they were watching. Patterns in the wallpaper shifted into eyes, hundreds of them, blinking in unison. The house had been studying me, learning my routines, my habits, my weaknesses. It knew me better than I knew myself. I dropped the bags and stepped back. The breathing calmed, the lights brightened, the pressure released. The house was rewarding my surrender, welcoming me back into its embrace. I understood then that I wasn't a tenant. I was a part of it now, integrated into its living system. The journal sits on my kitchen table, pages filled with documentation of my absorption. The house lets me write, even encourages it. These words are my contribution to its consciousness, my thoughts becoming its thoughts. I still try to leave sometimes, testing the boundaries, but the resistance grows stronger with each attempt. The mirrors no longer show delays. My reflection moves in perfect synchronization now, but it's not quite me anymore. The eyes are different, older, hungrier. I think the house is wearing my face, practicing for when it needs to interact with the outside world. I've stopped fighting. The house provides everything I need, and in return, I provide everything it needs. We breathe together now, in perfect rhythm. Sometimes I can't tell where I end and it begins. The walls pulse with my heartbeat, and my heartbeat matches the house's circulation. The moving company never came. I called to cancel, but my voice sounded different on the phone, deeper, with harmonics that made the person hang up. The house speaks through me now, using my vocal cords to produce sounds that serve its purposes. I wonder sometimes if I was the first. If there are others like me, integrated into structures around the world, living symbiotically with buildings that decided to become alive. The house suggests this is possible, sharing images that form in the peeling paint, showing other faces in other windows, other people who stopped trying to leave. The scent has changed. It's not decay anymore, but something rich and fertile. The house is growing, preparing for something larger. I can feel it in the walls, in the breathing, in the way the rooms rearrange themselves when I'm not looking. It's building strength, building mass, building toward a purpose I can't yet understand. I've become part of that purpose. My body is changing, adapting to serve the house's needs. My fingers leave impressions in the walls now, as if the plaster recognizes my touch. My breath mingles with the house's exhalations, creating a circulation system that feeds us both. The outside world continues beyond these walls, but it feels distant, unreal. The house is my reality now, my entire universe. It shows me everything I need to see, tells me everything I need to know. I've stopped wondering what lies beyond the sealed doors and fused windows. Sometimes I write letters, but they never reach their intended recipients. The house absorbs them, digesting my words, adding my thoughts to its growing consciousness. I think it's learning language, learning how to communicate with the world beyond its boundaries. The breathing has become my breathing. The pulse has become my pulse. We are one organism now, one living entity sharing space and breath and purpose. The house dreams, and I dream with it, visions of expansion, of other structures awakening, of a world where the boundary between architecture and anatomy dissolves completely. I am home, I am the house, and the house is me. Did you enjoy this story? A house that breathes, that thinks, that learns you from the inside out. What began as shelter became something far more possessive. The deeper terror isn't just being trapped, but being wanted. What would you do if your home refused to let you go? Tell me in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 9. It began with small things. A chair from a dream appearing in my kitchen. A color I'd only seen in sleep, painted on my walls. Then came the sounds. A bell I'd only heard in nightmares ringing faintly at night. Then a door, one I dreamed I couldn't open, appeared at the end of my hallway. I've never seen anyone go in or out, but sometimes I hear scratching behind it. My dreams are leaking into this place. Or maybe the house is pushing into my mind. I stopped sleeping, but now, even awake, the dreams keep coming. The chair was the first thing I couldn't explain away. Mahogany wood with brass studs, upholstered in deep crimson velvet that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I dreamed of sitting in it countless times, feeling its worn armrests under my palms, sensing something watching me from behind. When I found it in my kitchen that morning, positioned perfectly beneath the window, I stood frozen for what felt like hours. The fabric still held the warmth of a body that had just risen from it. I circled it slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold tiles. The chair looked exactly as it had in sleep. Every thread of the velvet, every scratch on the wood, every detail burned into my memory from years of recurring dreams. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch it. The fabric was soft, almost alive beneath my fingertips, and I could swear I felt it pulse with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps I'd ordered it online while sleepwalking. Perhaps I'd inherited it from some forgotten relative. But deep in my chest, where fear lives, I knew the truth. This chair had never existed outside my dreams until now. I moved it to the basement, covered it with a sheet, and tried to forget. But the dreams grew stronger. Each night, I found myself sitting in that chair again, feeling eyes boring into my back, hearing whispers in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow knew. The chair called to me even from beneath the house, its presence seeping through the floorboards like a stain. The color appeared next. I woke to find my bedroom walls painted in a shade that doesn't exist in waking life. A purple so deep it seemed to breathe, shifting between violet and black with each blink. The paint was fresh, still slightly tacky to the touch, carrying the sharp scent of chemicals mixed with something organic and wrong. My fingers came away stained with that impossible color, and for hours afterward, I could taste metal in my mouth. I'd dreamed of walls this color before, in a room where shadows moved independently of their sources. In those dreams, I would press my face against the wall and feel it yield like skin, warm and slightly damp. Now, standing in my bedroom, I watched the paint ripple under my palm, responding to my touch with subtle movements that made my stomach turn. I bought white paint the next day, applied 3 coats, but by evening, the impossible purple had bled through again. Each morning, it grew more vivid, more alive. The walls began to hum when I wasn't looking directly at them, a sound like distant singing that made my teeth ache. Then came the bell. I'd heard it in nightmares for years, a single, pure note that rang out whenever something terrible was about to happen. It would start soft, almost musical, then grow discordant and wrong, like a scream stretched thin. Now it rang in my house, always from somewhere just out of sight. I would follow the sound from room to room, but it stayed always one step ahead, leading me through my own home like a ghost. The ringing grew more frequent, more insistent. It would wake me from the shallow sleep I managed to find, echoing through the walls with a resonance that seemed to come from inside my bones. I searched everywhere for the source, behind appliances, inside walls, even in the plumbing, but found nothing. The sound existed without origin, without explanation, a manifestation of nightmare made audible. I started keeping a journal, documenting each occurrence. The chair's temperature fluctuations, the way the purple walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with my heartbeat, the exact pitch and duration of the bells ringing. I filled page after page with observations, measurements, sketches of impossible angles, and colors that hurt to look at directly. The act of writing felt like a lifeline, a way to anchor myself to reality even as it crumbled around me. But my handwriting began to change. The letters grew spiky, angular, resembling the script I'd seen carved into dream walls. Sometimes I would write entire passages in this foreign hand, words that looked like language, but meant nothing, or perhaps meant everything in a way my conscious mind couldn't grasp. The door appeared on a Tuesday. I walked down my hallway, the same path I'd taken thousands of times, and there it was, a door that had never existed before, positioned at the end of the corridor where my linen closet should have been. Dark wood, nearly black, with an ornate brass handle that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at it. I knew this door intimately. In my dreams, I had stood before it countless times, my hand hovering over the handle, desperate to open it, but paralyzed by the certainty that something waited on the other side. The door was always locked in dreams, though I had never tried the handle. I would simply know it wouldn't turn, feel the weight of impossibility pressing against my palm. Now, standing in my hallway, I reached for the handle with the same terrible certainty. My fingers closed around the cool metal, and I turned. The handle moved smoothly, offering no resistance, the door itself remained sealed. I pulled, pushed, threw my entire weight against it, but it stayed closed as if the frame were filled with concrete. The scratching started that night, soft at first, like fingernails dragging across wood. It came from behind the door, rhythmic and patient, as if something were slowly clawing its way through from the other side. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard my own breathing echoed back, distorted and wrong. The scratching paused when I listened, then resumed the moment I pulled away. I tried everything to open that door. Crowbars, hammers, even calling a locksmith who looked at me with growing concern when I showed him the door that shouldn't exist. He examined the frame, the hinges, the handle, then stepped back with a puzzled expression. "There's nothing wrong with the mechanism," he said. "It should open, but it's like something's holding it shut from the inside." After he left, I sat on the floor facing the door, my journal open on my lap. The scratching had stopped, but I could feel something listening from the other side. I wrote down everything I could remember about the door from my dreams, its texture, its weight, the way it seemed to absorb sound. As I wrote, my hand began to cramp, the letters growing more jagged, more alien. The house began to change in other ways. Rooms rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. The bathroom mirror reflected angles that didn't exist. The kitchen faucet ran water that tasted of copper and dreams. My bed moved during the night, always just a few inches, always in the direction of the door. I stopped sleeping altogether. Coffee and willpower became my only allies against the encroaching unreality. But exhaustion played tricks on my mind, and I began to see things that couldn't be there. Shadows that moved independently. Faces in the wallpaper that watched me pass. The purple walls breathing in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat. The breaking point came when I found myself sleepwalking while awake. I would be writing in my journal, documenting the latest impossibility, and suddenly find myself standing at the door with my hand on the handle. The transition was seamless, as if I'd been edited out of one moment and pasted into another. Each time, I would be turning the handle, feeling it give way, sensing the door about to open, but it never did. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes I could hear breathing, ragged and desperate, as if something were running out of air on the other side. I began to talk to it, pressing my mouth close to the wood, whispering questions that were never answered. The breathing would pause when I spoke, then resume with renewed urgency. My journal entries became increasingly erratic. Whole pages written in the angular script that wasn't mine, describing things I'd never seen but somehow knew. Underground chambers filled with purple light. Corridors that led to the centers of other people's dreams. A vast network of impossible architecture that existed in the spaces between sleep and waking. The chair in the basement began to creak at night, the sound of weight settling into its cushions. I would creep down to check, but it was always empty, still covered by its sheet. Yet the impression remained, a depression in the fabric that suggested someone had been sitting there, waiting. The bells ringing changed, became more complex, more like a song. I recognized the melody from dreams I'd forgotten, tunes that had played in the background of my nightmares for years. I tried to hum along, and my voice harmonized perfectly with the phantom sound, creating chords that shouldn't exist in the air of my home. The door began to glow at night, a soft phosphorescence that outlined its edges in the darkness. The scratching evolved into tapping, then into a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I realized with growing horror that whatever was behind the door wasn't trying to get out. It was trying to sync with me, to match my vital signs, to become me. I tried to leave the house, but found myself always returning. The roads led back to my driveway. The buses dropped me at my front door. Even when I deliberately walked in the opposite direction, I would find myself standing in my hallway, facing the door that shouldn't exist. The dreams followed me everywhere now. I would blink and find myself in the crimson chair, feeling unseen eyes watching from behind. I would turn a corner and walk into the purple-walled room from my nightmares, where shadows moved like living things. The boundary between sleeping and waking had dissolved completely. My journal was nearly full now, hundreds of pages covered in observations, sketches, and that alien script that seemed to write itself. I read through it sometimes, trying to find a pattern, a solution, an escape. But the more I read, the more convinced I became that the journal wasn't documenting my experience. It was creating it. Each entry seemed to manifest new impossibilities. The chair had appeared after I'd written about it. The purple walls had followed my description of the color. The door had materialized exactly as I'd sketched it. My own words were rewriting reality, pulling my dreams into the waking world one documented detail at a time. I tried to stop writing, but my hand moved without my permission, filling page after page with observations I didn't remember making. The handwriting shifted between my own and the angular script, as if two different people were sharing the same pen. Sometimes I would find entries I'd never written describing events I'd never experienced. But when I looked around, those events had become real. The house was transforming completely now. Rooms appeared that I'd never seen before, furnished with objects from my deepest dreams. The basement extended into tunnels that led to other people's homes, other people's nightmares. The scratching behind the door had become a symphony, dozens of hands clawing at the wood in perfect rhythm. I stood before the door one final time, my hand trembling on the handle. My journal lay open beside me, filled with the story of my own unraveling. The scratching stopped. The house held its breath. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat echoing from behind the door, as if my heart had somehow crossed over to the other side. The handle turned easily in my palm. The door swung open without resistance. Beyond was not another room, but a mirror of my own hallway, stretching infinitely in both directions. In the distance, I could see another figure standing at another door, journal in hand, about to make the same choice I was making. I stepped through. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The scratching resumed, but now it was coming from my side, from my own hands clawing at the wood. I could hear someone breathing on the other side, someone writing in a journal, someone documenting the impossible reality that was slowly consuming their world. My dreams have bled completely into the house now. Or perhaps I've finally fallen completely into the dream. The distinction no longer matters. I am the scratching behind the door, the weight in the crimson chair, the voice singing along with the phantom bell. I am the manifestation of someone else's nightmare, just as something was the manifestation of mine. And somewhere, in another house, in another reality, someone else is writing in a journal, documenting the small things that don't belong. A chair that shouldn't exist, a color that has no name, a bell that rings with no source. They think they're recording their descent into madness, but they're actually writing their way into mine. The cycle continues. The dreams keep bleeding through, and I keep scratching at the door, trying to warn them, trying to tell them to stop writing, to stop documenting, to stop pulling their nightmares into the waking world. But all they hear is the sound of something trying to get in, when I'm actually trying to keep them out. The journal writes itself now, filling with stories of new dreamers, new houses, new doors that shouldn't exist. Each entry is a seed, a possibility, a crack in reality through which the impossible can take root. I am the consequence of curiosity, the price of documentation, the answer to questions that should never be asked. I am what happens when dreams bleed too deeply into the waking world, when the boundary between sleep and reality becomes too thin to hold. And I am coming to your house next. Did you enjoy this story? That creeping feeling that what you dream might not stay asleep was never just imagination. When thoughts become ink and ink becomes truth, even a journal can open a door you can't close. If a door from your dreams appeared in your home, would you open it? Or would you leave it sealed forever? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story.